Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture in our political behavior side of the course. We have moved past the midterm, we have mastered institutions, and now we dive into behavior. Today we're going to talk about the foundations of political behavior. And to begin, let's go over the assigned reading for today. I assigned you the first chapter and introduction of Mancur Olson's book, The Logic of Collective Action, Public Goods, and the Theory of Groups. First, Olson's core argument is that when groups seek to achieve a collective good, that's something that benefits everyone regardless of their contribution to that goal, individuals have an incentive to quote-unquote free ride. What I mean by free ride is that they prefer to let others bear the costs of action while still enjoying the benefits from that action. For example, having clean air that's unpolluted benefits everyone, but each person has little incentive to act alone to reduce pollution because they're still going to benefit from the cleaner air produced by others' efforts. This problem is especially acute in large groups where the individual contribution is less visible and less essential. Basically, the contribution of a single person in a group of 400 is going to seem less consequential than the contribution of a single individual in a group of 4. Olson argues that this logic explains why many broad-based interest groups, such as consumers of products or the general public, struggle to organize effectively. This is a collective action problem. Because of the free rider problem, Olson shows that collective goods rarely get produced without additional mechanisms at play. To overcome collective action problems, groups must provide quote-unquote selective incentives. Those are benefits available only to those who participate in the action. These can be material incentives, such as discounts or magazines for members of unions or interest groups. This is a little old of a book, I know. That's not perhaps as interesting of an incentive to you guys now, but still. They can be social incentives. That's prestige, respect among peers, belonging, solidarity with the group, or even coercive incentives. Those are legal requirements and mandatory dues to participate in the group. By tying private benefits to participation, groups can motivate individuals to contribute to the provision of collective goods that they otherwise wouldn't support. This concept remains central to understanding how, for instance, lobbying organizations or professional associations and even unions sustained membership when faced with all of the struggles that they do today. Third and finally, Olson emphasizes that the size of a group has a strong effect on its ability to act collectively. I talked about this a little bit with point 1, but small groups can monitor members and punish free riders more easily, making cooperation more likely. By contrast, large groups face coordination problems and diffusion of responsibility. We don't know who's in charge or who to blame, which makes it hard to mobilize resources. This leads to an important political implication I want you to know. Small concentrated groups with strong incentives, like specific industries or professional associations, tend to exert disproportionate influence in politics compared to the diffuse general public. That's you guys listening to this lecture right now. This helps explain why policies often seem to reflect an organized minority rather than the preferences of the broader majority. When I say minority, I mean numeric, not necessarily racial or political. So let's dive in. Let's turn to political behavior, the study of how citizens think about, interpret, and act within politics. This lecture here establishes the foundations of how people form attitudes, what information they use, and what factors shape political decision-making. We're not yet going to dive really deeply into political psychology or information processing or even how behavior manifests in parties, but today we're just going to focus on developing these building blocks of political behaviors and set the stage for the second half of the semester. So let's dive in. First, What is political behavior? Well, political behavior systematically studies the ways ordinary people engage with politics. It's not only about voting, it includes how citizens form opinions, interpret events, and use information to decide on policies or candidates. Scholars examine both cognitive processes, those are how the mind works, and social influences. That's your social identity, your personal identity, your social networks, or even the institutions that you're a part of and interact with. Because democratic systems depend on citizen participation, studying behavior is key to evaluating whether democracy functions effectively. And you're going to notice that as a through line, not just through this lecture, but through the rest of the semester. Oh, fun fact also, political behavior is an academic journal for which you will be reading at least one paper from this semester. One tradition to examining behavior, not just in politics, but in social sciences, uh, as a whole, is rational choice, which treats people as self-interested actors who gather information to maximize goals. But in practice, rational choice seems a bit flawed. People face what the scholarship calls bounded rationality. They lack time, knowledge, and cognitive capacity to process everything given to them. We also have this notion of prospect theory, which highlights how people react more strongly to losses than to equivalent gains. Basically, if something negative happens to you at the same level as something positive that happened to you earlier, you're going to react more strongly to the negative thing than to the positive thing. Psychological perspectives reveal how framing, emotion, and shortcuts strongly influence decisions as well. Together, these approaches underscore that political choices aren't purely rational, but they're rather shaped by human limits. I want to do a quick aside here to first thank the Decision Lab. They have a lot of really great figures and broken down explanations of cognitive decision making and psychology, and I pulled a bunch of figures from their website for today's lecture. But this one was one of the best, right? So you have limited knowledge, you don't understand everything about a particular issue. You have cognitive capacity, you have an inherent limited ability to process what limited information you have, and you also have time limits in processing this information. No one, not even us in our ivory tower, can spend all day sitting there thinking about these fundamental questions of political participation and the universe. Sometimes we need to go do laundry or take out the trash. So these three elements together form bounded rationality, which then under those restrictions influences our decision making. Now, this isn't to say that bounded rationality is the end-all be-all of political behavior and political psychology, but it is a helpful way to dip our toes into those waters and think about it in kind of a pragmatic way. Speaking of, let's talk about how this cognitive processing applies to politics. A belief system refers to how well a person's opinions fit together. Most Americans show limited ideological constraints. Opinions on one issue don't really consistently predict other opinions within an individual. Political sophistication, that's how knowledgeable or how devoted to politics an individual is, political sophistication varies. Some individuals in our society have structured, informed beliefs, while many others show an intensely low consistency in those beliefs. Increasingly, partisanship serves as the organizing framework, structuring attitudes even among the less informed. We'll get into that later. Rather than abstract ideologies, partisan identity often guides how people make sense of politics. So below here, I have a figure. It's a political compass. You might remember these from high school. Maybe your high school social studies teacher made you take one of these quizzes to see where you map on these two axes. The y-axis goes from libertarian at the bottom to authoritarian, how big the government should be, and from left to right on the x-axis, left being, what we conceive of as leftism, and right being what we conceive of as right-wing. This person here has mapped on individual ideologies into the spatial makeup of this political compass. And the thing about American politics is these ideologies don't map on very well to how average citizens act. We are a very non-ideological public, despite the fact that we experience high partisan sorting and polarization. Remember, we talked about those in the first half of the class. Research consistently shows that American political knowledge is limited. Many can't identify key office holders or constitutional principles, which I know you guys clearly will never have a problem with because I made you read the Constitution ad nauseum. Instead, they use shortcuts, otherwise known as heuristics, to approximate decisions. Compounding this, misinformation is highly persistent, even after corrections from trusted elites, which will explain what that means, or even family members and peer networks. Media institutions and elites shape the information environment, determining what citizens are exposed to and how issues are framed. Thus, political knowledge is shaped less by an individual's initiative to educate themselves, but rather through structural access to information and elite cues. I hinted at heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. Mental shortcuts are heuristics. Get that in your head. It will probably be on the exam. Instead of mastering policy details, citizens rely on signals like party affiliation, ideological labels, or trusted elites to form their opinions. A trusted elite would be like, for instance, say, I am MAGA and I am a very staunch Republican. I might trust something from Donald Trump more than I would trust something from Chuck Schumer, and vice versa. If I were a centrist Democrat from New York, I would trust Chuck Schumer over Donald Trump. Those would be my trusted elites. These shortcuts can produce reasonably accurate choices, but they also risk reinforcing bias or manipulation. If I'm a MAGA Republican and I only listen to Donald Trump, I'm not going to be exposed to varying viewpoints that might actually align better with my lived experience. The democratic dilemma, then, is whether heuristics are sufficient for our democracy to function. Basically, are citizens making informed choices? Are they being guided without understanding the decisions they're making? Evidence in the scholarship shows that shortcuts often work, but not always reliably. I want to talk about this figure here. This is also from the Decision Lab, and while this is showing one type of heuristic, the representativeness heuristic, I think it's really helpful and kind of funny. So you have the stick figure here who says, "Who stole my cookie?" And he's thinking about this pamphlet that he read that shows that a stealer looks like this weird oval-bodied creature here with the single oval body rather than the two circular-bodied creature next to him. So regardless of if that weird green and red oval bodied creature actually stole his cookie, he has been primed through the heuristic that oval bodied creatures are stealers. One central question that underlies a lot of the political behavior literature that I'm hinting at here is whether or not citizens are competent to govern. Critics of citizen participation argue that most citizens lack the knowledge required for meaningful participation. Others suggest that democracy doesn't require every citizen to be highly informed. Rather, the system aggregates across individuals so informed minorities can guide outcomes. Basically, it all comes out in the wash. Deliberation and discussion, that's discussing politics and talking about issues of the day, can improve reasoning, but there are limits to this. Deliberation isn't going to fix everything. Overall, we find that democracy is resilient, but citizen competence remains contested, both in theory and in practice. I have an Onion article cited here, Uninformed Citizens Scrambling to Research Last 2,500 Years of Democracy Before Voting. That's the far other side of the coin here. That obviously never happens, but I think it's funny. Political behavior includes more than voting, right? So these uninformed citizens, they're out there, they're participating anyway. Citizens participate through protests, through petitions, through campaign activity, through community organizing, and even through contacting officials. I know I've encouraged several of you to contact your congresspeople if you have problems, and many of you apparently have not gotten through, which, shame on them. But participation is uneven. More affluent, that's wealthy, educated, and older citizens engage more consistently, creating inequalities in influence on public policy or even just the way that our government looks. Barriers like time devoted to politics, resources, whether money or otherwise, and feelings of powerlessness can restrict participation. Political efficacy, the belief that one's actions matter, is strongly linked to engagement. This highlights how structural inequalities and subjective perceptions both shape participation. Why do I have an image of the pig on the screen here? Well, this is Pegasus. He ran for president in 1968 at the Chicago Democratic Convention, and he was a very popular candidate, brought about through political participation in a very non-conventional means. I think that you all should look up Pegasus, and you will have a good afternoon of it. Political behavior is rooted in socialization. It's the lifelong process of acquiring orientations toward politics. Family is often the first influence, shaping partisanship and values. Peers, of course, reinforce or challenge early orientations. So your family gives you politics either through you affirming what you've inherited from them, they're Democrats, you become a Democrat, or through you rebelling against them. They're Democrats, so you don't want to be like your parents, so you're going to be a Republican. Schools transmit civic norms through curricula, rituals, and history instruction, of course. And major events like wars, economic depressions, and social movements leave generational imprints that shape attitudes for life. Socialization explains, in part, why citizens hold the political identities that they do, and why those identities often endure across decades. But it's only part of the puzzle. The other part is values. Values play a central role in political reasoning. Americans draw on core beliefs like liberty, equality, and fairness, but these values often conflict. For example, do we put all of our eggs in the basket of liberty, or do we put our eggs in the basket of security, which necessarily requires some bridging of liberty, or equality versus individual responsibility? Such conflicts create what we call ambivalence, leading to unstable or context-dependent opinions. Policy debates often reveal these value trade-offs. Despite ambivalence, core values endure and anchor political life, even as individuals balance them differently across issues. You might have an issue that you deeply care about that is immobile, that no matter what happens, you are not going to change. And that can then inform and color the rest of the values you have that might change slightly based on your political opinions and experiences over time. Group identity remains one of the strongest predictors of political behavior. This isn't just peer networks, this isn't just your family. Racial groups, gender, class, and religious identities profoundly shape attitudes, and partisanship, of course. Today, partisanship itself functions like a social identity, for better or worse, with people perceiving politics through the lens of in-group and out-group dynamics. By that I mean, if I am a strong Republican, I am less likely to like a Democrat just because they're a Democrat, knowing nothing else about them, and vice versa. These attachments organize political conflict and, to a degree, explain polarization. Citizens aren't simply isolated decision makers. I'm not just sitting there in a room with nothing on the walls, not thinking about anything but politics and not given any external stimuli. I am not an island thinking about this. People are members of groups that structure and constrain their choices. So, some takeaways here. Political behavior reflects the intersection of cognitive limits, heuristics, those mental shortcuts, values, and social identities. Citizens rarely act as fully rational actors. Instead, they rely on those shortcuts, values, and group attachments to navigate politics. Socialization and structural factors further shape their engagement, creating inequalities in political participation. While debates over citizen competence remain, and we'll dive into those a lot next week, democracy has, up to this point, proven resilient through aggregation of group opinion and participation, as well as mobilization. These foundations, of course, and ideally, prepare us to examine public opinion, political psychology in more detail throughout the rest of the semester. Thank you so much.